Alrighty then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 130. I am your host, pannobhasa, and this may be the shaggiest you ever see me because the cold weather is pretty much over, and I think my woman might give me a haircut tomorrow, but I'm still kind of intermediate. I'm like ambivalently poised between getting my beard trimmed shorter or just growing it long with like a braid and like a Mjolnir bead hanging at the bottom of it. I can get away with that shit because my ancestors, at least a lot of them, were Germanic. So you'll find out at the next Q&A, I suppose. And so I'll just take a sip of my chosen beverage, which is not from my Styx cup, as you can see, because my woman doesn't like Styx very much anymore. She says he's becoming a lol cow, partly because he's wearing like a pirate hat sometimes in his videos now. And also the whole New Orleans thing, not New Orleans, New Orleans. And just kind of like dumping his wife and all that stuff. Women, it's like a lot of people, especially women, I think, they cannot really differentiate the person and like the productions of that person. You know, it's like Bill Cosby is all of a sudden not funny anymore, even though he was a fairly good stand-up comedian back when I was a kid. Or also Woody Allen, not funny anymore, just because of their kind of sexual kinks, so to speak. Michael Jackson, you know, his music. I mean, people still listen to Michael Jackson's music, apparently because the whole him doing inappropriate things with white children was not really conclusive, and a lot of people don't believe that he did it. So anyways, I guess I should just start answering questions, and it's going to be a moderate amount of questions. It's going to be like the middle path between the extremes of not nearly enough questions and way too many questions. And the first question is from Cherzaskazis, who interestingly now goes by the name of Julie. So I do hope that after his transition, he at least had the common courtesy to his woman to at least convert to being a lesbian. And Cherzaskazis says, Julie, if non-material beings such as ghost or human souls exist, which are believed in many religions, and they can see, hear, and think without a body, then why people need eyes to see, ears to hear, and brain to think, and dreams, or otherwise we call them dead. We are living in a material world, and materialism seems to explain things in this world we are living right now. Thoughts? Well, I think we can just kind of ignore other religions and just kind of go with Buddhism, especially Theravada Buddhism, because that is really the main perspective of these videos that I'm making. And according to Theravada Buddhism, ghosts are not non-material beings. Ghosts have a physical body, much as we have a physical body. It's just that the matter of which they are composed has a different subtlety than ours. Going with more modern lingo, it's like the physical matter of which ghosts are composed, their bodies anyway, has a different frequency or vibratory rate or whatever. And with regard to human souls, from the Buddhist point of view, they don't exist. So really, any kind of beings, if they can see and hear, as a general rule, they've got physical eyes and physical ears, even though they might be invisible from our point of view. Nevertheless, they're just at a different subtlety of matter, and they still have eyes and ears. Like according to the legend, the Buddha, immediately after his enlightenment, he was thinking, who should he teach Dhamma to first? And the first people that came to mind were his two teachers who taught him meditation. And then he realized, they're in formless realms. They won't be able to hear me say anything. And so then he had to find somebody else, which turned out being his 5 ascetic companions before his enlightenment. So you do have to have physical sense organs in order to have sense contact and sense consciousness and sense perception, going with Buddhist philosophy. So I'm just going to go on to Terzaska's or Julie's second question, which is why you make a special point on not telling lies when you occasionally drink beer and maybe once in a while kill a mosquito, maybe. Well, I haven't really killed a mosquito in quite a long time, just because I'm not really exposed to mosquitoes much here. I mean, when you're living in the tropics, I killed more mosquitoes, ironically, as a monk than I do as a layperson, because as a monk, I might be living in a cave with no screen door, mosquitoes coming in, and I mean, you just sit there and get bitten. And actually, killing mosquitoes, it didn't happen nearly as much when I was a monk as killing, like, biting flies, because a mosquito just itches when it bites you, plus maybe you get malaria. But like a horsefly or a smaller, like a sandfly kind of thing, I mean, it hurts, and they come in swarms sometimes, and I just never had the patience to just sit there and be bitten by horseflies. It just wasn't going to happen. There was this one kind of fly, I'm not sure what it's called, maybe a sandfly. It was sort of a salt and pepper, kind of a grayish mottled color, and it was longer than a housefly, but not nearly as big as a horsefly. They would come in swarms, and I would use my sweat rag. I was getting really good at, I had like a little washcloth that I'd use largely for wiping sweat, but it was also necessary just as a flail to keep biting parasitic insects off of me. And I got really good. Like, you got one on your arm here, you kind of hit it from like the other side, so it has like this whiplash effect and goes really fast when it wraps around. And I was just getting too lethal to be appropriate as a monk. I mean, at first, you know, it's like you almost kill it and it flies away, and that's fine. But anyways, I try to compensate my demerit from killing these insects by feeding them to antlions, because the place where I was living under this rock ledge where I had no mosquito net or anything like that, I was just a sitting duck for any parasitic insect that came along. There were a lot of these antlion pits, and those of you who live in places where it rains a lot may not know what antlions are, but it's a kind of insect that digs this cone, it's like a funnel shaped pit in sand or dust, and things fall into it and it grabs them and eats them. And so I'd feed the nice little antlions with the victims, or I mean, I was kind of the victim. I was striking out in self-defense. So I did get a little bit of merit to kind of compensate for the demerit of killing them. Little bastards. But I have to admit, I have occasionally fed live food to those fishes back there. And I'm not the one that's killing them, but still, I mean, when you're dropping brine shrimp, live brine shrimp, which when I was a kid were known as sea monkeys, when you drop them in there, the fish, they just kill them all off. It's like brine shrimp genocide, kind of. But getting back to the question here, see, I'm just digressing all over the place. I haven't even started answering the question, really. Why you make a special point of not telling lies when you occasionally drink beer and maybe once in a while kill a mosquito? Well, I mean, telling the truth is important. And I mean, I've gotten myself in trouble by just brutal honesty, I guess. You know, everyone else is expecting, like job applications or something, everyone's expected to just lie, but I don't do it. And I mean, it's just better. There's more integrity in drinking a beer every once in a while, and maybe killing a mosquito once in a while, and just owning up to it than pretending that you don't, because that's dishonest. And you're still drinking the beer and killing the mosquito anyway. So by lying about it, you're just adding more demerit to the pile, I guess. So I think I'm just going to move on to Julie's, actually Trzaska's third question, which is, did you learn the most popular Polish word on a first day on a Polish ship? Yeah, this is with regard to a statement I made on the previous Q&A, where I worked on a Polish ship when I was 21 years old, the Sagita, which is Polish for Sagittarius. There was a Polish fishing fleet off the coast of they would fish off the coast of Oregon for hake at the time. And the fishing fleet was named after constellations. So I was on the Sagita with Captain Bogumik Klamka. And it was like the cuss word, just the interjection of choice for Polish sailors is kurwa. And one time I asked the technologue, who was one of the officers on the ship, what does that mean? And he just kind of awkwardly says, it means change. But I don't see how change would become the favorite cuss word of Polish sailors. So anyone knows what kurwa literally means, just put it in the comments below, and I'll finally figure it out after all these years. But it wasn't the first day, but it happened pretty frequently. When stuff would go wrong, you'd have all these Polish sailors on the back deck of the ship and saying kurwa. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from the saboteurs. And I'm not sure if the saboteurs is really more than one person, or it could just be one person pretending to be more than one person just to kind of increase their clout or something. And the saboteur says, what is mind? So what is mind? It doesn't matter. And what is matter? Never mind. It was just too hackneyed of a joke for me to pass up. But what is mind? It's sort of like energy in physics. Like consciousness. Mind would be consciousness and mental states, I suppose. Going with English words. So, yeah, mind would be a combination of consciousness and mental states, like perception and volition. So if you want to know what consciousness is, it's getting into energy to a physicist, where it's practically an undefined term. You just have to dig down until you get down to sort of the bedrock of words that, you can't really define them in other terms, because you have to have sort of the basic fundamentals of words that they don't really have anything beneath them. And energy and physics, that's just the basic. That's what physics is all about, is the study of energy. And so in a sense, it's kind of ironic, but also kind of appropriate that it's practically an undefined term. You can say it's like the capacity to do work or some such. But with regard to consciousness, you can say it's awareness. But, you could also say it's energy. Personally, I think ultimately energy and consciousness are the same. So, empty space, according to some physicists anyway, empty space contains both zero energy and infinite energy. And so, you could say the same thing about empty space contains zero consciousness and infinite consciousness, kind of a thing. But what is mind? It's just one of these words where, everyone knows what mind is pretty much, because that's really the only thing you can know for sure. If you can know anything for sure, it's your own consciousness, because anything else you know indirectly through your own consciousness. But I guess a really simple, what's the word I'm trying to think of? I can't even think of the word I'm trying to think of now. It's not sufficient. Insufficient. An insufficient brief explanation would be awareness. So, yeah. But technically, from a Buddhist point of view, mind or citta would be consciousness. And consciousness is sort of like, Theravada Buddhism has real difficulties trying to explain consciousness because they can't really have it as the substance of mental states, which in my opinion it is, because they have to put it all at the same level of reality. So they've got perception and consciousness being equally real at the same level of reality, and nibbana and all sorts of things. It's everything is just at the same level of ultimate reality. And yeah, I mean, it's like the substance of thought would be another way of defining mind or consciousness. Or, I mean, if you want to use mind in the broader English sense, it would be both consciousness and mental states. And I think I better just move on to the next question. This is from Sampapalapa. And Sampapalapa says, what's the longest time you have meditated? And I assume he means the longest time I ever just sat in meditation without getting up. And that was fairly early on in my career as a bhikkhu, when I was able to sit in the full lotus for 2 hours straight. So it would be somewhere in the neighborhood, maybe plus or minus a little bit of 2 hours. And the thing is, my legs have never been extremely flexible, and I was never able to sit in the full lotus without agony for much longer than 2 hours. But I mean, with regard to just meditating in general, if you're doing intensive meditation, you're meditating all day. You know, it's like you sit for an hour, and then you're mindful of the desire to stand up. You're mindful of the actions involved, the physical actions of standing up. You're mindful of, you know, the changes in your vision as you're standing up. You know, you're mindful of all these things. Then you start doing walking meditation, and so it's unbroken. Like some Burmese Seattles, they talk about, if you want to start a fire, you rub two sticks together, and it's not going to happen if you rub two sticks together for a while and then just set them down, and then a while later you pick them back up and rub them together some more, and then you set them down, and a little while later you come back and start rubbing them together again. You're never going to get a fire. So you have to keep rubbing the sticks, which means that even when you're not sitting cross-legged with your eyes closed, you're still meditating. You're still practicing satipatthana, mindfulness of walking, mindfulness of seeing, mindfulness of whatever it is that you're doing. And with regard to that kind of meditation, then, yeah, pretty much all day when I was doing really intensive meditation, like at a meditation retreat or like a self-retreat out in the forest, just going for it full blast, then pretty much the only time you're not meditating is when you're sleeping, or if you're just, you know, your mind wanders away and you just start thinking about something, or you have to interact with a visitor or something, and then maybe the meditation or general mindfulness will, you know, kind of evaporate. But with regard to sitting cross-legged, which was in the full lotus, it was about 2 hours. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, how were the pyramids built? And I'm going with the standard, like, archaeological theory that the Egyptian pharaohs had armies of thousands of slaves, and that the building blocks of the pyramids were pulled with ropes over rollers, however many miles it took to get there. And they do have theories now that the pyramids, like the Egyptian pyramids especially, we're not talking like Aztec pyramids or prehistoric Chinese pyramids. We're talking Egyptian pyramids, like the Great Pyramid or the Great Pyramids of Giza, that originally they were sort of in a spiral. They were built with like a spiral ramp going around the outside so that the rocks could be pulled up. To get them up to the top, they'd be going up this ramp that went along the outside of the unfinished pyramid. And I guess there is some evidence that that is the case based on whatever it is, you know, sort of like, what is it? Ultrasound or something, or was it deep sensing sonar? I don't know what it's called. But, you know, they can see the structure of like a spiral ramp going along the outside of the pyramid going up towards the top. So, yeah, that would be my main hypothesis. I think space aliens had nothing to do with it. Technologically advanced Atlanteans after Atlantis sank under the ocean. I don't think they had anything to do it. If it wasn't armies of slaves using Stone Age or Copper Age or very early Bronze Age technology, then maybe it was priests who were channeling the power of some god who was able to help build these pyramids. But I really do not think that space aliens or Atlanteans had anything to do with it. And I will just point out once again that I think in all probability Atlantis was just a garbled legend accounting for the Minoan civilization centered on Crete. And that Crete ceased being like the local power in the Eastern Mediterranean, largely due to the eruption of Thera, like an ancient volcanic island about 70 miles from Crete, which may have wiped out the Cretan navy and also blanketed the island of Crete with enough volcanic ash that the crops died, so that their civilization was hurt badly enough that Mycenaean Greeks or Dorians could then invade Crete and take it over and just turn it Greek. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, what are your thoughts on this excerpt from the book Blood Meridian on the Nature of War? And he kindly left a YouTube link in which Judge Holden is giving his theory of war. And Xenothoid continues here, Judge Holden is seen as one of the most evil villains in fiction, often compared to the devil, the Gnostic demiurge and its archons, Mara, etc. I like Cormac McCarthy's paraphrasing of Heraclitus's quote, war is the father of all things, in this speech by the judge. And yeah, in the speech by the judge finishes by saying, war is God. And I mean, it was too long of a speech for me to really address everything he says. But really, what he does say about war has some dark wisdom to it. It's like war created the human race. I mean, the judge doesn't say that. I'm saying that. It's like Darwinism accelerated through war. That's one reason why the human race evolved as fast as it did, up in the last 100,000 years or so, is that, war was fueling that instead of being attacked by leopards and bears, we're being attacked by barbarian tribes and that sort of thing. And it was just the strongest succeeded. And like in Western civilization, you start off with the Greeks and then you had the Romans after that, and both of them they were militaristic civilizations that turned kicking ass into a science. That's one of the main reasons why the Greeks and the Romans were as successful as they were, is because they were using like Western ingenuity as ways of like improving the efficiency at which they could just like slaughter their enemies. So, Judge Holden is kind of glorifying that and justifying that, and saying that it's sort of like the force of Darwin, or even like God to him in like shaping mankind. He wouldn't care about people kind. He would use mankind for him. And it's sort of like Darwinian evolution combined with like honor and like the value of life, at least the value of the winner, the value of life to the victor, that sort of thing is just, to him, that's the purpose of life. Sort of like Conan the Barbarian paraphrasing Genghis Khan, what is best in life? To defeat the enemy, to see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of the women. And there is a kind of dark wisdom to that, because that kind of element added to a civilization makes that civilization just ass kicking. And so they're more likely to prosper. And then, of course, they get real prosperous, and then they start getting decadent with like compassion and human rights and all this, and then things start to collapse or at least decay, and then some other warlike barbarous tribe just kind of sweeps in and takes over. So I think really civilization, once you take away the militarism, then you start getting into a state of like castrated degeneracy. It's almost inevitable. And so, it may be better to have a certain amount of militarism guided by ideas of justice and honor than to have castrated degeneracy. So, Judge Holden was kind of an extremist on that score. I don't think he might have cared all that much about justice. It's just might makes right. But still, to have a certain amount of militarism, like Trump is trying to return the United States to after, a Democrat administration has the main purpose of the army being promoting gay rights and this sort of thing around the world. Handing out food packets, that kind of thing. Like, who is it? Hegseth says, the main purpose of a military is lethality. Either the ability to kill your enemies, or else just be scary enough that your enemies just aren't going to mess with you anymore. So it's a kind of harsh worldly wisdom that is pretty much unavoidable so long as you are living a worldly life. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. Also from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, what do you think of this Friedrich Nietzsche quote? Under peaceful conditions, the warlike man will attack himself. I think some warlike men will attack themselves just in a way, just sort of abuse themselves through like over drinking and just acting crazy and getting in fights, biker bars and that kind of thing. Although a lot of other warlike men under peaceful conditions will just they will attack other people. Like my father, when he was a younger man, he liked bar brawling. He'd go to a bar for 3 reasons: get drunk, pick up a woman, and fight somebody. He liked fighting when he was a young man. He'd pretty much outgrown that by the time he became my father. But still, there are guys like that. And so under peaceful conditions, the warlike man won't necessarily attack himself. He may just become like a biker or a gang member, or, just fighting amongst themselves. But maybe Nietzsche had something else in mind that I'm not thinking of. Maybe he was thinking on a higher plane than that. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid also. Can you explain the symbolism of Kali killing Shiva? And I assume he's referring to the pictures you can find occasionally in New Age homes, for example, especially New Age female homes of, Kali, who's like dancing on the body of Shiva. She's got like the necklace of human heads. She's got like blood dripping everywhere, the tongue sticking out and the fangs and all that. And apparently that came from a legend where the Devas and the Asuras, the gods and the Titans, were having one of their wars. And somehow Kali just started fighting. She just went into a kind of berserk frenzy and just started killing all the demons or the Asuras. And then after they were killed, she just kept killing and killing until she was just going to kill everything. She had momentum going. She was on a roll. And so the other gods go to Shiva and say, look, she's your consort. You deal with her. You got to stop her. So he goes and she kills him too. But then, killing him kind of caused her to realize, whoa, well, I think I'm overdoing it somewhat. So then she breathed life back into Shiva, and Shiva was all better again. And I think part of this is just the standard Indian system going back into Vedic times of whatever God that you're worshiping is the highest God, a manifestation of the highest God. So Kali, in this case, was just demonstrating herself as like the supreme deity who can even kill Shiva and then restore Shiva to life, maybe with some feminine life-giving, like the stereotypical, miracle of giving life of women thrown in, because the females are the ones who bring life more than males do, at least, biologically, I guess. And Kali is just kind of interesting to me because it wasn't until early modern times that Kali was becoming a kind of cosmic deity who actually had some good aspects. Now she's like the slayer of defilements, the slayer of demons, that kind of thing. But I mean, there are mention of Kali goddesses in the Pali texts, and they're pretty much demonesses. They're like cousins of Mara. And so Kali was a kind of demoness who haunted battlefields up until maybe like the 1600s in India. I think it was like in Bengal especially that she started being reformed and turned into a kind of cosmic good goddess with like a fierce aspect in slaying evil, kind of a thing. But the symbolism Kali killing Shiva, I think my best guess is that Kali worshippers, who she's like the big one, she's just demonstrating her superiority. Like in the Bhagavad Gita, you've got Krishna declaring himself to be Shiva, in addition to all these other gods. Like he's Brahma, he's Shiva, he's all the pantheon of gods, he's everything. So to a Vaishnavite, it's like that's showing that Vishnu is greater than Shiva, because Shiva is just one of the aspects of Vishnu. And it's kind of the same deal here, where Kali is supreme because she's even killing Shiva and then restoring Shiva to life. And I mean, that's my best guess, although a Hindu who knows more about the legends and all this might know better than me on this case, with regard to this case. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libralam and occasionally still known as Libralam. And he says, have you ever had nada, and then in parentheses he's got inner sound, in meditation? And so I don't fully understand this, that nada is Spanish for nothing. But why he would equate nada with inner sound, I don't know. But nada, just nothingness. Yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount of nothingness that has arisen in my meditation. Sort of like it reminds me of St. John of the Cross, his ascent of Mount Carmel. The ascent of Mount Carmel is just nada, 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 nada. Just nothing, 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 till you get to the peak of, the highest realization that a human being is capable of experiencing. But when Stellar Supreme identifies nada with inner sound, then yeah, I can't really relate to it. I mean, I have meditated in which, you can hear like your pulse in your inner ear. It's like you can hear your own blood pressure, essentially. Your mind gets so silent, and you're in a silent cave. And so, I mean, you can hear like the blood rushing through your inner ears, which then has some effect on the eardrum, presumably. But it hasn't been anything metaphysical that I'm aware of. I haven't heard any celestial music or anything like that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipat Zidana says, please explain the Sambhogakāya. And I'm no authority on the Sambhogakāya. It's a Mahayana Buddhist concept. And it's one of the three bodies of Buddha, the three kayas of the Buddha. First, you've got the Nirmanakaya, which is just the physical body of Gautama Buddha, the sage of the Shakya clan. Then you've got the Sambhogakāya, which is sort of like a celestial Buddha in like a kind of heaven realm. And then you've got the Dharmakaya, which is sort of like the essence of Buddhahood, which is sort of like omniscience or infinite consciousness that pervades the entire universe. And I have read that early Mahayana only had two bodies. They had the Nirmanakaya, or the physical body of the Buddha, and then they had the Dharmakaya. And I have read, I don't remember where I read this, possibly in A.K. Warder's Indian Buddhism book, that it was the Yogacara school, which arose after the Madhyamaka school. It was sort of like a, I wouldn't call it a reform of Madhyamaka, but it was sort of built upon Madhyamaka philosophically. And I think it was kind of a step backwards from Madhyamaka personally. But the Yogacara school, according to whatever author I was reading, was it was them, or they, who came up with this Sambhogakāya concept. I mean, it's certainly not an early Buddhist concept. It's it arose centuries after the time of the Buddha, according to scholarly authorities. And it was the third of the three bodies of the Buddha to get traction, become famous, become like official Mahayana Buddhist doctrine. So, I mean, if you compare the three bodies of the Buddha with like three versions of God in like Christianity, like the Nirmanakaya, the physical body, would just be like Jesus the carpenter's son living in Nazareth. And then the Sambhogakāya would be sort of like Christ in glory, enthroned in heaven with the angels fluttering around him and that sort of thing. And then the Dharmakaya would be just like God Almighty, who is just pervades the universe and doesn't really have a physical body, that sort of thing. So I'm just going to move on to CO of Action Sipad Zirna's second question, which is, have you ever felt like if you read through the suttas or other profound texts somewhere, you would find what you were missing and immediately find the key to Nibbana? For some reason, I have this hope and I don't know why. Well, when I was young, maybe, before I'd read everything. Now I've pretty much seen everything there is to say on the subject of like becoming enlightened. Although occasionally after, I've stopped looking, then, I'd stumble across, or just karmic coincidence would just land a book into my hands that was just right what I needed to read. Like, for example, there's a book by Paul Lowe called In Each Moment. And I was going through a rough time as a monk because I was just like struggling against my own defilements. It was like I was trying to be a perfected saint, just like the texts say, a monk should not feel anger, a monk should not feel lust, a monk should not feel hatred, a monk should not have preferences, and it's like trying to live up to that. It's like you're trying to be somebody else. You're trying to be not yourself. It's like you're like rejecting your own nature and just like trying, possibly in some cases, trying to use like Khmer Rouge tactics against your old defilements. Just destroy your defilements. And it results in a lot of like frustration and hysteria, and just sometimes it could even get to the point of self-loathing. And it really was not working or helping all that much. And then I get this book, In Each Moment by Paul Lowe, who's saying, don't be against your own nature. Don't be against, even if you are against your own nature, don't be against your own againstness. Just accept the way things are, which is kind of like a Krishnamurti kind of teaching too. And it just happened to be the right thing at the right time. It was just what I needed to read. But it wasn't like I had this feeling that if I just get this book or some book, it's going to help, because I figured I'd already read everything. But every once in a while, you'll just get this nudge, in an unusual direction. It's like, it might be saying stuff that's not so different what you've already read before or heard before, but it's just hits you at the right time from just the right angle to nudge you in just the right way to make some improvement, to make like a growth spurt, a spiritual growth surge kind of a thing. So have I ever felt like if I read through the suttas or other profound texts somewhere, I would find what I was missing and immediately find the key to Nibbana. At this point, I can pretty well appreciate that. You're not going to find the secret of reality written in words. Genuine knowledge is not in words. The name that can be named is not the eternal name, I've said that like 3 videos in a row at least. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. So it's not so much the words or what this or that sutta says. I mean, if you haven't read it before, you haven't been exposed to that information, then maybe. But generally, wisdom literature, once you're familiar with that genre, it becomes more and more unlikely that you're going to come across something that's just going to go, wow, I never considered that before. Because once you've read the mystical literature, like the higher, more advanced dharmic texts of various religious systems, you've read Krishnamurti, you've read all this stuff, then eventually you get jaded and it doesn't have much of an effect on you anymore. You've already read the same general stuff over and over again. And in Theravada, it's even more that way because it's more limited. Doctrinally, you're not going to have all these extreme views, this whole spectrum. It's going to be a much more narrow spectrum. So, yeah, when I was young, I felt that way, I suppose. But the more experience you get, the less you feel that way. But then, like I was saying, every once in a while, you just might, out of the blue, due to your own karma, just get hit with this teaching that just hits you the right way and nudges you in the right direction. So I'm just going to move on to Sambhogakāya Sipad Zidana's next question. How do I come to terms with friends moving on like Tig? It makes me not want to meet new people in the first place because I know what is to eventually come. Well, that's impermanence. Sabe Sankara Anicca. Everything that has a beginning has an end, Neo. That's just basic Buddhism. It's just something you bear in mind. It seems like that Sambhogakāya Sipad Zidana has a certain amount of clinging to others that, he wants it to be permanent or something. And anything that has a beginning has an end. It's just something that it requires a certain amount of dharmic maturity or something to just really accept that that's just the way it is. And it could be that, you really take that to heart and it might inspire you to just go alone like the horn of the rhinoceros and become a renunciant recluse, which is something that I did for many years. Or on the other hand, you might think that human interaction is worth the fact that it's not going to be permanent. Everything that has a beginning has an end. This reminds me right now of my woman's mother's boyfriend has a son who, he's apparently, maybe I shouldn't say this, but his body is wrecked. He's got like stage 4 cancer, and he's had a number of strokes after being diagnosed with that, and he's got blood clots and all sorts of things going wrong with him. And there's a good chance he's not going to be here a week from now. And as a father, I never met the guy, but his father certainly has. And that's just what you may have to face in life if you interact with other people that, yeah, they're going to be taken away from you sooner or later. That's just right there in the Pali texts. Like read the Sala Sutta of the Sutta Nipata, that, just as all fruit, it eventually falls from the tree, or just as anything made of clay is eventually going to get broken, that it's the same way with the life of mortals. And lamentation is useless because that's just the way of the world. So, you got 2 choices. You can, if you don't want to have to deal with the impermanence of human interactions, then, you just go alone and become a renunciant recluse, or just a recluse or whatever. And I mean, otherwise, if you think that there is still value in it, I mean, it's like, why bother eating ice cream? I mean, it's going to be gone. You're going to eat it all and then it's going to be gone. I mean, does that mean you shouldn't eat ice cream? I mean, it's good while you're eating it, and then you run out. I mean, the bowl's empty. Oh well. At least you can get more ice cream, and you can get more friends too. So, I mean, it's just a matter of personal choice. I think the traditional, ancient, early Buddhist approach is, well, it's all impermanent, so you're better off just not wallowing in it, not getting any attachment to it at all. But still, I mean, there is a difference between having a friend and clinging to a friend. So you can have a friend and appreciate that friend and enjoy that friend's company, derive benefit from that friend. And then when you just go your separate ways, there's no moping and lamenting about it. It's just, that's just the way life is. Anyway, yeah, and you're going to find Tig again. I mean, he's already been kicked off our server twice, once as an American, apparently, and once as an Ethiopian. So Tig takes many forms, and he may come back as, say, Japanese next time. And then you can be friends with him until he's kicked off again, and then he'll come back possibly as Uruguayan. And you can make friends with him again and enjoy that. But don't cling, because clinging is the cause of all suffering. Clinging and attachment and desire and craving and delusion. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA. And PSA says, are you secretly a vigilante superhero with a double identity, fighting crime and bringing justice to the world when no one's looking? And that should be an obvious no, because there are certain people in this world, if I really was a superhero, that, I mean, they wouldn't be in their position right now, because I'd mess them up. So, I mean, it could just be that I believe in karma, and it's like, well, if I take out this James Bond supervillain type person who is causing all kinds of havoc in the world, that, it'd make bad karma for me, so I'll just let him keep doing that. But then I wouldn't be much of a vigilante superhero if Buddhist ethics prevented me from harming any being. So, I mean, I gotta deny it anyway, because otherwise I wouldn't secretly be the vigilante superhero anymore. So, yeah, I can't just blur it out, in reality, I am Wonder Warthog. Next question. This is from Yuga-U. And Yuga-U says, I met a person who does a Goenka meditation. They told me that you should not know anything about Buddhism and learning Dhamma is useless. I was baffled. I tried convincing them that right effort is important, but failed. Any thoughts? And then in parentheses, he's got, they told me that it comes from meditation, right effort. Well, Goenka meditators are like the Jehovah's Witnesses of Buddhism, that a lot of them are just fanatical. And they have like a similar attitude, or at least many of them do, as Jehovah's Witnesses, where is if somebody leaves the group, they stop being a Goenka meditator and start following some other method, they're just considered dead. They're just shunned, which is what Jehovah's Witnesses often do also. And I mean, they are just, a lot of Goenka people are just totally convinced that they have found the way and that you don't need to do anything other than the Goenka method. I mean, I knew this Canadian monk. He didn't last very long. I met him in Burma, and he was a Goenka meditator, and he gets ordained as a monk just because he wanted to live in a certain cave, and only monks could stay and meditate in that cave. So he became a monk so he could meditate in this cave and do his Goenka retreats, his 10-day Goenka retreat, or what are they called? They're not called retreats. I can't remember what they're called. But anyways, sometimes I'd be trying to teach him some kind of Dhamma, and he'd get this look of just like, it's like he could hardly stand me telling him just basic fundamentals of Buddhist ethics and philosophy. It's like, I don't care about that. Goenka is my father. I'm completely satisfied with his teachings. I don't need to know anything else. And I mean, how many Goenka meditators become enlightened? Goenka wasn't enlightened, according to his own confession. Well, I did read in like a Goenka pamphlet once. This is like the words of S.N. Goenka himself. That I mean, if you need to swim, it's good to like have practice in swimming. You ought to know how to swim and not just have like a degree in swimology without ever having gotten into the water. So that, I mean, to that extent, sure, personal practice is more important than reading stuff in books, but still, I mean, the Goenka method is like very much stripped down and simplified, probably oversimplified, and it does not seem to be a method that really can take you as far as some other methods can. So those are my thoughts, I guess. But I mean, try and talk sense to a Jehovah's Witness and see how far you get. And try to talk sense to a Goenka meditator who is just absolutely persuaded Goenka is his spiritual father. You're better off not knowing anything else about Buddhism other than what Goenka has taught. Then, I mean, it's pretty much the same situation. So, I mean, just even knowing this, like the 3 marks of existence, that kind of thing. I assume Goenka teaches that, but I don't know what kind of emphasis he puts on it. But even the Goenka system had the entire Pali Tipitaka printed, but they had like the stuff that was emphasized by Goenka printed in red ink, and the rest of it printed in black ink, so you could know which parts especially to study. Anyways, I'm just going to move on to Yugu's next question, which is, what is the reason that in the West, all bad things that happen are attributed to karma and all good to God? It's baffling to me that people think karma is only responsible for bad stuff. Well, that's just kind of it's like a colloquial use of karma, like instant karma especially, where you do something bad and then something bad happens to you. You know, it's like you can see videos like on Rumble or something, instant karma, where somebody pulls a gun on a guy and then the guy just pulls out his own gun and shoots him, that kind of thing. Or some guy tries to carjack somebody and then the guy in the car just runs him over, that kind of thing. Instant karma. So I guess it's mainly because of that sort of thing. Although sometimes you'll hear about karma, you know, there's a good person has something good happen to them, and some people will say, yeah, that's his karma too. It's just that it's just more commonly used with regard to the instant karma kind of thing of somebody's doing something bad and immediately gets smashed because of it. And in the West, now all good isn't attributed to God, definitely, because there's so many atheists that just aren't going to do that. Plus, really religious people will tend, if they're in a religious, contemplative kind of mood, will accept that, you know, whatever happens to you is the will of God. Although that's more of a Muslim thing now than a Christian one, I think. So, yeah, I mean, I haven't really noticed the same. I mean, there's a certain trend in that direction, but I really don't think that in the West, all bad things that happen are attributed to karma and all good things are attributed to God. You know, some people don't believe in karma or God. So, I mean, the majority of people aren't going to be attributing bad things to karma. And probably most things, I mean, even Christians, unless they're feeling particularly spiritual at that moment, will just think that good things that happen is just good luck or, you know, your own doing or whatever. Natural phenomena taking their course. So, yeah, I don't entirely agree with the generalization that here in the West, all bad things are attributed to karma and all good things are attributed to God. But it is more likely that karma is considered a bad thing, mainly just because of like instant karma videos on like YouTube and Rumble and BitChute and X. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, almost all of my friends are more successful than me, make more money than me. This really bothers me. Any idea on how I could deal with this? Well, I mean, it's a fairly superficial point of view. Maybe it's a traditional cultural point of view that success is equated with the amount of money you make, which isn't true at all, especially from a spiritual point of view. I mean, from like a biblical Christian point of view, it's the exact opposite. You know, it's the poor who are going to go to heaven, and woe unto the rich, for they already have their consolation. So, yeah, I mean, it's a superficial point of view, possibly like a cultural, like an Asian point of view, where, you know, the doctor is more respectable than the carpenter. But, I mean, Nirmit seems like a relatively, like, philosophical, relatively spiritual person who should be able to acknowledge the plain fact that, I mean, true success is not measured in dollars or whatever the unit of currency is in your country. I mean, that is really just superficial, and you shouldn't even play along with that kind of thing. Just if you're happier than them, but I mean, if it bothers you that they make more money than you, then I mean, that's one of the reasons why you're not as happy as you could be. So, I mean, I'm not rich. I drive a forklift for a living, and I really don't care. You know, it's like I can live fairly comfortably. I can support my woman fairly comfortably. You know, we can eat restaurant food sometimes. We're not in debt. Well, I guess I'm still making payments on the Jeep, but still, the house is paid for. Technically, although you don't really own property in America because of property taxes. It's like you're still renting. You don't pay your property taxes. They just take the house away from you. So anyways, how you deal with, I mean, you're better off. Well, I don't know. From many religious points of view, including early Buddhism, you're better off not being rich. I mean, in Buddhism, I mean, the most serious practitioners of Buddhism are the monks, and they're forbidden even to touch money under almost any circumstances. I mean, you're penniless, literally. I had zero money for 30 years. So it's just a matter of perspective. I mean, there's nothing necessarily wrong with having most of your friends having more money than you. Maybe you should just find poorer friends. Golly. But seriously, I mean, you should, if you look at it philosophically, you should realize that real success is not measured in money. Real success is measured in wisdom or goodness or happiness, not in money. And a lot of rich people are just messed up people. Michael Jackson, he was sort of a role model for a long time. He was just one of the richest, most famous people in the world. He was rich, could buy pretty much anything he wanted to, buy a chimpanzee, buy a castle, whatever. And he was a messed up, miserable person. Howard Hughes, one of the richest people of his day, he was a messed up individual. A lot of rich people are messed up. In fact, I mean, like a relatively destitute Burmese villager has less unhappiness in his life than the average multi-millionaire or billionaire in the West. Just because they have fewer desires. Second noble truth. All suffering is caused by desire, plus the other things that I mentioned several minutes ago. So, I guess it seems to me Nirmit has enough understanding, really, to comprehend and agree with what I've just explained. So I don't really see what the problem is other than just habit. So be mindful of it when this unhappiness arises, and then you'll understand it better and stop reinforcing it. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Thermal Squid. And Thermal Squid says, why should we strive for enlightenment if we can be properly suspicious that terms such as enlightened beings refers to nothing or are otherwise unquantifiable? I have hit a wall here and can't escape a kind of skepticism or nihilism about the reality of something like enlightenment, despite the fact that I'm arbitrarily certain that other elements of the Dhamma are reliably true. For example, that the world is a denser mental state and that consciousness is undesirable, etc. However, I cannot make much sense of the advice that striving for enlightenment, which is implied to be impossible or nebulous, is both samsaric or hindering, and also the object of our urgency. Well, let's see here. Yeah, enlightened beings. I mean, that's an oxymoron in a sense, because ultimately there is no being. And it's part of the problem that Thermal Squid has, it seems to me, based just on this question, just disregarding all the other stuff that he has written or composed, texted, printed, whatever, is, I mean, he's just stuck in his mind. He is addicted to intellect. So, I mean, you cannot know reality by thinking about it. You cannot know reality intellectually. And ultimate reality is just off the scale. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Within the context of delusion, which we are in, I mean, the samsaric reality is just pseudo-reality. This isn't ultimately real. So it's like, if you can't bring ultimate reality into this delusion, then what's the point? Why go for this ultimate reality? Because we're in this world of delusion. We're stuck in this world of delusion at present. Why should we even try? Because you can't prove that enlightenment can exist within the context of delusion. But you got to transcend the delusion, and the reality is always there. And there's no one that's, well, I mean, there's some people, I guess, but still, I mean, Buddhism is largely based on the idea that even though a person may not become enlightened, I mean, you have to kind of say that just because it's so mind warping to try to deal with reality and delusion, or like reality and pseudo-reality at the same time, because you try to mix them together and it doesn't work. You just wind up with confusion more confounded. Or is it confusion worse confounded? But there is reality. I mean, that would be hard to deny. And this isn't it. That would be a little harder to deny, I suppose, but still, it's definitely deniable. So, I mean, it's like, if I can't drag like highest truth into the context of falsehood, what's the point of trying for the highest truth? I mean, that seems to be what's going on here. So let's see, let's just read this a little more here. I have hit a wall here and can't escape a kind of skepticism or nihilism about the reality of something like enlightenment, despite the fact that I'm arbitrarily certain. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, just forget the theories, forget like the attempts at intellectual comprehension of what cannot be intellectually comprehended. I mean, skepticism, I mean, that's actually good. Skepticism is a good thing in the classical sense of suspending judgment, because when you suspend judgment, ataraxia can arise, or it's like essentially mysticism. And some people just are not mystically oriented. So, I mean, I do sympathize with people that do not have a mystical bone in their body, because really that's the way you know reality, is through mysticism, not through any kind of intellectual endeavor, unless maybe you're going to be like a hardcore Majamaka philosopher who uses just brute force of intellect to demolish all beliefs, which then just leaves silence and clarity and emptiness behind, through which reality can shine. Okay, so let's just skip down here. However, I cannot make much sense of the advice that striving for enlightenment, which is implied to be impossible or nebulous, within the context of delusion, yeah, it is impossible. I mean, within the context of samsara, nirvana really may just have no meaning because, I mean, delusion cannot contain ultimate reality and recognize it as such. So, striving for enlightenment is both samsaric or hindering, and also the object of our urgency. Well, striving for enlightenment, it's in a way one of the main reasons why striving for enlightenment is effective is eventually you realize that it doesn't work. But you have to fully realize that, not just intellectually. I mean, you have to really deeply see the truth of it. Like the smaller discourse of voidness, where the monk gets into deeper and deeper meditative states until he gets into what is arguably the highest possible attainable meditative state. And then he realizes that's not enlightenment either. It's like, no matter how high you go, that's not it. And so then it's like something clicks, or he just kind of gives up, and boom, he's there. But I mean, you can't short circuit it. You can't just give up right off the bat, because then really you haven't had the necessary liberating insight. And I'm just going to check and see if we're really recording. And yeah, good. We've been recording for over an hour, in fact. Let's see. Yeah. And the battery's charging and everything. This is good. It's good. So I guess I have addressed Thermal Squid's first question. I hope, at least to my own satisfaction, sort of. So I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's second question, which is as follows. If we can only use folk terms for mental states with language or abstraction never capturing reality, what is the criteria for liberation? Well, I mean, you have to put that into words, wouldn't you? Which isn't going to work. But he continues, I'm sure I've asked something like this before. It's not a question of right perceptions or right view, but there seems to be no real grounding to the reality of something like a liberated being. The predicaments of various interpretations and contentions surrounding meditative states seems inevitable, and that by and large they are totally unresolvable because mental states are not qualifiable or able to be mapped. Having insight that the intellect is established seems to not actually help us here. We might say that an enlightened being is free of suffering, but this seems to be ripe with potential for confusion. A being may appear to not experience suffering, yet their internal world could be radically different, etc., outside of the consensus of agreement on what certain words mean or their relationship to reality. Truth would then seem to be totally irrelevant or even impossible. Yeah, well, truth is kind of an oxymoron, because truth implies statements, and statements that are representative of reality, and statements do not represent reality. So in a way, truth is an oxymoron. You're better off dealing with reality than truth, if that makes any sense. But let's, I guess the question mark is up here at the top. If we can only use folk terms for mental states with language or abstraction never capturing reality, what is the criteria for liberation? I mean, it'd be awareness of reality. That's my interpretation. It'd be, if you are fully enlightened, then you're always aware of reality. Sort of like, using Christian terminology, a person who is the most advanced Christian would be someone who is constantly aware of the presence of God and does the will of God. You know, like the divine puppet that St. John of the Cross talked about, who has mortified his own self-will and just acts in accordance with the will of God. And I mean, it doesn't matter what the paradigm is. If it's intellectual and made out of words, it's going to be inadequate. I mean, you have to do the work. You have to, attenuate your own delusion sufficiently that you get more and more of an awareness of reality shining through you. That, like, the more foolish you are, the more opaque you are spiritually. And then the more advanced you get spiritually, the more transparent. First, you got like the translucent phase, like a shower curtain, that kind of thing, the frosted glass of the bathroom window. And then you get more and more transparent so that truth is just shining through you unhindered. And I mean, trying to understand it in words just isn't going to work. I mean, there's like makeshifts that are adequate for the time being, adequate for your purposes. But I mean, you just go with logic, I suppose. It would seem to me logically pretty solid that there is reality. There is some ultimate reality. This may not be it, but it's there. And also, it does seem to me that there is one Kantian thing in itself that we have direct access to, and that is the Kantian thing in itself of our own consciousness. So, through practicing meditation, if you're doing the right kind of meditation, you get access to the Kantian thing in itself of consciousness, which is like direct insight into reality, not based on any kind of philosophical cogitations. I mean, that's just running in circles. It's just an exercise in futility. The only real positive benefit of like intellectual philosophizing as an attempt to understand reality is, one, it's good as a bullshit detector. You're able to identify faulty reasoning. And two, it can result in something like Majjhimaka, where you can just tear apart any belief, leaving clarity and silence behind. So, did I answer the question? What is the criteria for liberation? Awareness of reality. Knowing reality. I almost said knowing the truth. Knowing reality. Just firsthand, without having to think about it, without having to theorize about it, without having to put it into words of any kind. And some people delude themselves into thinking that they're there when they're not there yet, but that is one of the hazards. And nevertheless, I mean, knowing ultimate reality is like the most noble thing you can strive for, it seems to me. I mean, you could try to feed and clothe and house the entire population of the earth, and even if you succeeded, still you're just putting band-aids onto a problem, and you're not really penetrating through to just the transcendence of the entire illusory problem. So, I mean, even if you can't be sure that enlightenment exists, still, I mean, you should be open-minded, not just, nihilistic towards the idea, not just label it bullshit and move on to something else. That to know reality, to know the highest truth, so to speak, is a good thing, and you should be striving for it, even though there's clearly no guarantee that you will be successful. But striving for it is good karma anyway, but you'd have to believe Buddhist philosophy or some similar philosophy to take that part seriously. And I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's next question here, which is, do we have the power to say one way or another? And I'm not sure what he means by one way or another, so I'll have to read the subsequent commentary here. If these two former questions are unanswerable or result in paradox, then it seems that openness or interpretive eclecticism are actually degenerative. I'm going to have to back up. If these two, I got to really pay attention to questions like this. Lieberlam is like this sometimes too. If these two former questions are unanswerable or result in paradox, well, I mean, I have answered them, even though kind of a paradox if you're trying to take two different levels of truth and put them just on the same, just paint them on the same canvas. I mean, that doesn't work. So let's see. If these two former questions are unanswerable, or resultant paradox, then it seems that openness or interpretive eclecticism are actually degenerative, because we can more or less say or believe anything or be suspicious about anything in regards to the spirit or its function if we tell others or motivate others to see for themselves or conclude for themselves. We have a series of idiosyncrasies and something robust of which we can commit to or have faith in. In that way, I see dogma and orthodoxy as inescapable without losing the plot entirely. If we don't have the power to say one way over another, I don't see how skeptical doubt could be overcome at all. This process of spiritual or immaterial induction has no real ending. So I got to try and tease the actual meaning of this, just kind of coalesce it into language that I'm comfortable with, that works for me. So I think one of the main points that he's trying to make here is, if you just try to be eclectic and not follow some established traditional system, and somebody like Rene Guénon would insist that you have to follow an established tradition, that coming up with your own approach, I mean, it's just worse than useless, according to him. Although I don't necessarily agree. I do think that most people are better off following an established tradition, that the established tradition that has been tried and tested for centuries is probably going to be a better system than the average dude can come up with on his own. But there's always going to be outliers. There's always going to be like gifted or inspired people, just intuitive people who just are not conformists. They are not followers. They've got to do it their own way. So if they've got to do it their own way, then that's just the way it's going to be. And I was kind of like that. I mean, I followed Buddhist tradition mainly through Vinaya or monastic discipline. That was the strict tradition that I adhered to for decades, at least more than 2 decades. Not the full 30 years, because I was kind of slacking off towards the end after I came back to America, especially. But still, I mean, to have that kind of structure with regard to my practice, that was very useful for me. But I just could not believe everything in Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, like Abhidhamma. I reject pretty much the entire 3rd Pitaka of the 3 Pitakas, the Tipitaka. So let's see. Did I already answer the question? Let's see. If these 2 former questions are unanswerable, which I think I kind of answered them, or they result in paradox, and the paradox is there only if you try to force fit more than one level of reality onto the same level, which is what most people do, including the ancient Abhidhamma scholars, but that's neither here nor there. Then it seems that openness or interpretive eclecticism are actually degenerative, and for a lot of people they are, but not for everybody. Like if you're just a mystic by nature, then dogma can get in the way. See, because we can more or less say or believe anything or be suspicious about anything in regards to the spirit or its function, if we tell others or motivate others to see for themselves or conclude for themselves, we have a series of idiosyncrasies, not something robust of which we can commit to or have faith in. Well, it depends on the individual. There's all different kinds of folks, and some people, they just are followers. They are dogmatists. And so, of course, somebody like that, which would include almost all medieval Catholics, for example, most modern Burmese Theravada Buddhists, very dogmatic, just medieval in their thinking. But, I mean, the more westernized and modernized you are, the less likely you are, especially certain personality types, to just believe anything you're told. You know, the Kalama Sutta warns against this. I mean, the entire Jataka warns against this. So, yeah, I mean, for Thermal Squid, this seems to be more of a problem than it is for me. And it's partly because thermal squid is apparently addicted to intellect, that his approach to truth is through intellectual comprehension, or at least he's got to have a firm grounding in intellectual comprehension before he can really move forward with confidence or some such. And I don't think it works that way. That I think he is overvaluing intellect, even though a lot of people, that's all they know. There's intellect, and then there's just like, emotional bullshit. So of course, intellect would be preferable, but that is still insufficient. That you've got to do some meditation and get past the thinking. Once you learn how to stop thinking, when you're wide awake, not thinking anything, then you can get insights into just how futile it is to try to understand reality by thinking about it. So it may be for some people that this is like a game changer. This is just a rule. Just, what is it? It just breaks the deal. It's a deal breaker. It's like, well, if I can't have like complete confidence intellectually in the validity of the entire system, then I'll just follow some other system. I'll just do something else. So, that's one of the hazards. There's always going to be a certain amount of filtering going on. And some of it's kind of tragic filtering, so where just the circumstances of your personality or your physical health or your position in life just prevents you from really moving forward spiritually. And some of it is fixable. Some of it may not be. Like if you got like some serious degenerative disease or something, you might just be stuck in this life that, it's just not going to happen in this life. And enlightenment doesn't happen for the overwhelming majority of people. But that's not to say that it's not worth striving for, because even striving for it's going to wind up with improvements in the situation. Even if you don't get all the way there, you're going to be making progress, which is preferable to not making progress. Anyways, I suppose I should just move on to the next question, which I trust will be easier to understand. And this is from Rui. And Rui says, for you, what would be the percentage of wheat and chaff in the canon? And also, what's your view of the fashion, even sponsored by some fully ordained mendicants, of Dhamma groups segregated by race and sexual orientation? Dhamma groups for black and brown people, Dhamma groups for queers, etc. Isn't developing a carapace against hypersensitivity a good chunk of the practice? Well, this is actually two questions, so I got to separate these. Okay, so I'll deal with the first question first. For you, what would be the percentage of wheat and chaff in the canon? And it depends on what your criteria for deciding between wheat and chaff are. Like I've said before, it's like at one extreme, you've got like verbatim quotes of the historical Gautama Buddha. And then, like one step away from that is you've got like paraphrases of what the historical Gautama Buddha said. Not in exactly those words, but, it's a fair paraphrase of what he said. The gist of it is there. Then another step farther from that is something that the Buddha really didn't say, but would probably agree with. He'd say, yeah, that's all right. Yeah, you can follow that. And then you've got like another step from that is like ambivalent stuff that, he wouldn't even talk about, and then at the other extreme would just be stuff that the Buddha would just vehemently denounce. This is not Dhamma. Don't follow this. And there are some teachings that would belong to that extreme, especially in Mahayana, but there's some of that in Theravada too. Mahayana just took the ball and ran with it. So you got just this full spectrum in Mahayana. You got somewhat narrower spectrum in Theravada. So with regard to what the Buddha would agree with and consider to be useful as wheat and all the rest chaff, You know, like all the miracle stories, the talking animals, you know, this kind of stuff, plus the stuff that the Buddha would just say, no, that's not good. Like aspiring to be reborn as such and such in a future existence. No, the Buddha would not have advised that. And with regard to, I mean, even with regard to certain philosophical beliefs, yeah, like, you know, well, I won't go into details, but there are like some cookbook like descriptions of how karma works. Like if you do this, it's going to result in 100 lifetimes of this result, kind of a stuff that I really don't think the Buddha would have taught that. I don't think the Buddha would have been advising people to worship him, that kind of thing. So getting back to the question, what would I consider to be the percentage of wheat and chaff in the canon? Let's go with 20% wheat, 80% chaff. So, I mean, that would rule out Jataka stories, Abhidhamma, all that kind of stuff. I mean, that would rule out half right there. So I'm being fairly charitable and conservative in saying as much as 20% would be stuff that the Buddha would endorse, even if he hadn't taught it in those words, that he would endorse this message. And, it might be less than 20%, but it wouldn't be much more than 20%, I'm pretty sure. And this position has put me at odds with like most monks. Like when I was a monk, I was still of the opinion that, 20%, maybe even as little as 10%. And I mean, some people just say, if you don't believe in it, why are you even a monk? Why do you call yourself a Buddhist if you don't believe in it? But I mean, it was the Jataka says, don't believe anything. And the Vinaya just says, follow these rules. And following the rules, I mean, it doesn't matter whether the Buddha really taught it or not. It doesn't matter if it represents ultimate reality or even empirical truth. It's just helpful to follow the rules. And aside from that, I was free to be skeptical in the classical sense. So, yeah, let's just go with 20% wheat. And I'm just going to move on to Rui's second question. And also, what's your view on the fashion, even sponsored by some fully ordained mendicants, of Dhamma groups segregated by race and sexual orientation? Dhamma groups for black and brown people, Dhamma groups for queers. Isn't developing a carapace against hypersensitivity a good chunk of the practice? Well, I wouldn't say carapace. Carapace is like a beetle's shell. It's like a hard shield. And really, it's better off, like the Tao Te Ching says, the sage should be like water. It's like water is more safe against a spear thrust than a carapace is. The spear can just thrust right through that carapace and just break a big hole in it. Whereas you stab the spear into water, the water just gives way. And then when the spear is pulled back out again, it just closes back up and it's fine again. So that would be the better way, is just, it's not being like insensitive or shielded. It's just being able to accept anything that comes along. But with regard to like, let's see, where is it? Segregating by gender, that's pretty standard actually. The Buddha segregated the Sangha by gender, assuming that the Buddha really did allow bhikkhunis to be ordained. That's a little bit controversial, a little bit debatable. But let's taking it at face value, what the suttas say, then the Buddha segregated the Sangha, male and female, just because when men and women mix, celibacy stops happening. You wind up with scandals, that kind of thing. Temptations at the very least. So that kind of segregation, that's got a long-standing precedent, and it's still kind of that way in Burma, where you'll have men on one side of the Dhamma hall and women on the other side of the Dhamma hall when the monk is giving a talk, that kind of thing. Or in like meditation retreats, that kind of thing, you'll have men and women segregated. Like Pandita Rama in Rangoon, when I went for a retreat there, it was the men had their meditation hall and the women had their own meditation hall, and there was almost no interaction, which makes sense. With regard to race, what would be the point? really the whole segregation by race and sexual orientation is more of a postmodern Western thing based on identity politics. And really, Buddhism, it discourages identity in general. The identity is delusion. So really, a lot of these woke, that's the word they use now. It used to be politically correct or progressive or whatever. These Dharma groups in the West that have special meditation groups for queers, special meditation groups for people of color, mainly black people, I guess, since the Asians are like Southeast Asians, they got their own groups. I mean, it's just sort of Western delusion infiltrating Dhamma and trying to take it over. It's like cultural Marxism, getting its tendrils into Dharma so that it can use Buddhism for its own purposes, its own political agenda. So yeah, I think that's a dumb practice. And I am sorry to say that this morning or earlier today, I did see a Dhamma video. My wife was playing a Dhamma video. I don't even want to say the monks involved, but they're considered to be relatively based, but it appeared that they had just pretty much sold out and they were endorsing, special queer meditation groups and that sort of thing. Or at least sort of accepting it as part of their monastic agenda as, teaching for lay people and so forth. So anyways, let's see. What's my view on the fashion? Even sponsored by some fully ordained mendicants, like the ones I was listening to today, of Dhamma groups segregated by race and sexual orientation. Yeah, with regard to gender, just for biological, problematical reasons, you're better off segregating men and women. Maybe even to some degree by age, because you teach children differently than you teach adults, sort of like Sunday school in Christianity. The kids all go and, color in the Jesus coloring book while the parents are listening to the boring sermon. That kind of thing might be appropriate. But a special queer Dharma group, that kind of thing, that just strikes me as cultural Marxism infiltrating Dharma. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, can you speak in general about the Jataka tales of the Buddha's past lives? Okay, well, the Jataka tales, it's one of the books of the Khuddaka Nikaya. And it's probably relatively late. Technically, the only canonical part of the Jatakas is the verses, and then the stories in prose are considered to be a kind of commentary, although they're generally printed together because you can't really understand the verse without knowing the story too. And in most cases, the story came first, and the verse is itself the kind of commentary that is kind of ironic. But Jataka is like the birth stories. It's stories of the Buddha's previous lives, sometimes as animals, sometimes as humans. Let's see. Can I speak in general about them? Yeah, and the Jataka stories, most of them probably were pre-existent. They existed already before Buddhists came along and converted them into the Buddha's past life stories. I think many, if not most, Jataka stories begin with, like once upon a time when Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares. It's sort of like the standard once upon a time in Western stories. This Brahmadatta was reigning in Benares. He was some legendary king in the distant past. And probably these were like the Panchatantra or like Aesop's fables that had already existed in Indian folklore. And then the Buddhists took them, not the Buddha himself probably, but Buddhists in general, early Buddhists took these stories that were pre-existent, most of them, and then just added like a Buddhist beginning and ending. So you've got like the wise rabbit who sacrificed himself to the god Saka, Saka, king of gods, because Saka, king of gods, came disguised as a mendicant the rabbit had decided he was going to offer food to a mendicant if he saw one that day. And he didn't have any food that mendicants like, because mendicants don't like rabbit food, apparently. And so he was just going to offer himself, this kind of thing. And it's like he had a friend, there was like a monkey and an otter, something like that, who did come up with stuff they were going to offer. The three friends, the rabbit, the monkey, and the otter, all decided they were going to offer food to a mendicant. And, et cetera, et cetera. And so at the end of the story, the Buddha says, well, I was the rabbit, and, Sariputta was the monkey, and Ananda was the otter, or whatever. I don't remember the names. And so you just take this story, like would be found in the Panchatantra or like Aesop's fables, and then it's just, at the end, the Buddha just identifies the main characters in the story with himself and, some of his chief disciples or great disciples. And it just turns into a kind of a Buddhist moral story. And then it was, to some degree, the Jataka stories that gave rise to the whole Bodhisattva concept. That was sort of like proto-Mahayana, was the composing of these Jataka tales, because it was making the Buddha more and more glorified above the average enlightened being, until finally the Buddha, like striving to become a Buddha, was considered so much more like praiseworthy and noble and glorious than just becoming an ordinary enlightened being. The Mahayana Buddhists just started saying, well, becoming an ordinary enlightened being is just inferior and you shouldn't do it. So, yeah, I do think it's like a later addition, that the Buddha himself wasn't teaching these Jataka stories, and I don't think that they really added much of value, other than sometimes you can learn cultural stuff from reading these Jataka stories. Plus, if you're just interested in talking animal stories, just for entertainment value, then there's that too. But I was never particularly interested in Jataka stories, to tell you the truth. I mean, I read a few as practicing Pali, or just for various reasons. Like two of the Parita, the protection chants that are among the most common protection chants in Burma, are based on Jataka stories. The quail Jataka and the peacock Jataka. And I mean, just the quail Jataka, you got this baby quail who is living in the forest with his parents, and then there's a forest fire. And this baby quail, who has human intelligence, makes a solemn asseveration of truth, a solemn proclamation of truth, because I know how to pronounce proclamation correctly. And I can't remember exactly what the proclamation of truth was, but it was the power of speaking that truth averted the forest fire. And the forest fire just went around where the quail family lived. And then the Buddha at the end says, I was that quail. And I mean, Burmese people can accept this at face value. Yep, the Buddha was a quail with human intelligence in a previous life who had psychic powers. I had one monk who had a degree in mathematics, he had a degree in physics, and he was a mathematics teacher at a high school before he was a monk. And I would be telling him about the Jataka stories and talking animals and so forth. And he's finally starting to come to my point of view. And he's saying, but I mean, when the Buddha was a parrot, I mean, parrots can talk. So maybe the parrot ones were true. But yeah, I think the overwhelming majority of Jataka stories are fiction. So that would be part of the chaff that I was mentioning earlier. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's second question, which is, are there any of these tales that especially resonate with you, or you feel contain the most wisdom an aspiring Buddhist can learn from? And no. The Jataka stories are not your best source of wisdom in the Pali Tipitaka. They're essentially talking animal stories, fairy tales. And I mean, you can get like a moral story, there can be some kind of ethical message, like in Aesop's fables, but still, there's really not a whole lot of profundity in the Jataka stories. So there's not a single Jataka that really stands out to me as something that I would consider to be profound. The baby quail Jataka, no. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's third question. Can you recommend a simple, compact version of the Jataka tales similar to Aesop's fables that I can purchase? Well, to tell you the truth, I would steer you more towards the Dhammapada commentary. You're going to find much more of value and much more of interest, unless you're really into fairy tales and talking animals. But if you really want to know what India was like in the Buddhist time and get some like well-known Buddhist stories that most educated Burmese Buddhists would be very familiar with, that most Westerners have never heard before, then yeah, go for the Dhammapada commentary. There's like a classic one by Burlingame. I think it's called Buddhist Legends by Burlingame, that is public domain. You know, it's an old book. You can download it for free off the internet. With regard to the Jataka tales, there is a book of Jataka tales that have like Pali on one side and English on the other. That's the book I was using when I was studying Pali, just sort of reading the Jataka in Pali and kind of referring to the English sometimes when I was just learning Pali. But aside from that, really, I cannot really wholeheartedly endorse Jataka stories. But I mean, if you can look it up on Amazon, something like that. I'm sure you can find like abridged versions of the Jataka stories. But again, I would much more highly recommend the Dhammapada commentary. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Paludniyawa Brahman. And I suspect that Paludniyawa Brahman is the same person that used to be called Skoladin or Skuladin, and then changed his name to Apocalypse Chow, because they're all into these bullet point things. So anyways, Paludniyawa Brahman says, would it be fair to say memories are rooted in familiarity, and inversely, if a person is committed to avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, then they're avoiding learning, deluding joy? I think maybe he means like diluting joy, like in chemistry, you're diluting a solution rather than deluding joy. I'm not sure. That's just a guess. But I mean, this is sort of a double question. Would it be fair to say memories are rooted in familiarity? I guess so. I mean, sort of. You know, they're rooted in kind of chain of association, like memories. It's my theory on how memories work is it's largely like emotional, or like a feeling. You just, a certain word or a certain image will trigger this feeling, which then sort of through, I mean, going with neurophysiology, through like synaptic connections, then connects you to this other memory, or this, you know, this stored info. So I guess to some degree that would be familiarity, I guess. And let's see here. And inversely, so we get like the crypto second question. If a person is committed to avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, then they're avoiding learning and deluding or diluting joy. Man. Well, let's see. Yeah, I mean, if you're committed to avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, yeah, I mean, that's one of the two extremes. I mean, seeking pain and avoiding pleasure would be the other extreme. So, I mean, you just live your life naturally. You try to do good, but I mean, you're not like avoiding any kind of unpleasantness at all costs. You know, within reason. You just kind of take what comes, then that's your best way of learning, because your karma is going to throw at you exactly what you need to experience. And trying to avoid pain or even discomfort or inconvenience and seek out pleasure and convenience and comfort, then in a way you're kind of stunting your growth, because you're avoiding a lot of the karma. You know, you're just sort of like holding it at bay, holding it back, preventing it from happening when it's going to happen sooner or later. And it may just have to wait for something to break before it can just flood in. So, avoiding learning and deluding joy. Yeah, well, with regard to the joy, yeah, it would be more of a delusional kind of joy. It wouldn't be as wise and spacious kind of joy as, like feeling rapture in meditation, that kind of thing. Just being able to accept whatever happens is a better kind of joy than trying to control everything so that you can prevent anything uncomfortable from happening. Then, yeah, that's a very fragile, like a kind of an inferior kind of joy. Although that is what almost everybody is going for, because people just naturally want to seek out pleasure and avoid pain, which is it's just built into us. It's like instinct, animal instinct. But by doing that, I mean, your happiness is a very fragile thing. So a certain amount of philosophy and spiritual practice where you can be happy with anything. I mean, as a monk, when you have no money, you got no family ties, you got no home, you don't know where you're going to sleep that night, what you're going to eat that day. Your stomach is empty, you're dripping in sweat, and maybe you got diarrhea besides, and you're still happy. Then, I mean, it's happened before. I mean, it's happened to me plenty as a monk where, you're sleeping on a concrete floor with a piece of wood for a pillow, just because that's the most comfortable way of being, I have to admit, because, I mean, it's just so hot. You want to be just on a cool concrete floor just because that's the coolest place there is. But still, I mean, you can be happy. You can be happy with an empty stomach. You can be happy sleeping on concrete. Just if you accept the situation, this is just the way it is and it's fine. I can accept that I'm not very comfortable. I can accept that my stomach is empty. I can accept that I have zero money. Then it's not a problem. Doesn't matter what it is. If you accept it, it's not a problem. And it doesn't matter what it is. If you won't accept it, it's a problem. But I'm not sure if I even answered the question. And since he kind of snuck in this second half of this question as kind of a fourth question, I'm just moving on to the next question. And he's saying, would you kindly, this is still, what's his name again? Paludniyawa Brahman, who I think is probably Skoladin, who's just having a little fun. He says, would you kindly give any insights into the movie Under the Silver Lake, which came out in 2018? And then the bullet points are, nobody fully got it. Every frame is coded in symbolism. There's something there, but no one understands. And I really can't give many insights into the movie Under the Silver Lake, because not only have I never seen Under the Silver Lake, I'm not sure if I've even heard of it before. I don't know what it's about. I have no clue as to what Under the Silver Lake is about. Although I have seen movies that are damned hard to understand, like possibly the most difficult movie to understand. It's obviously symbolic, but I saw it only once. Maybe if I watched it like 8 times and like was studying it on the internet, like I've done with other movies, I'd get it. But Synecdoche, what is it? Synecdoche, New York. I think that's what it's called. Synecdoche, New York, which is kind of a play on Schenectady, but it's Synecdoche. And that's a weird movie. And I mean, the guy's like, he's sitting there reading the paper and he's getting like years older just while sitting there reading the paper. That kind of thing's going on. Or Mulholland Drive. That is, I actually kind of understand Mulholland Drive, but I had to like study up by reading theories, interpretive theories on the internet just to try to figure out Mulholland Drive. But that's understandable. And even the Matrix. Most people can watch The Matrix and not get that it's a symbolic movie. The whole movie is a kind of parable. Or like reading Lord of the Flies by William Golding. I mean, college-educated, intelligent people can read the novel, forget the movies. The movies sucked. I mean, they just completely did away with the symbolism. But you read the novel, which is like an apocalyptic parable. Almost everything in the novel is symbolic of something else. They just think it's like a book about kids on an island. They don't get it. It's about human beings on planet Earth. So anyways, getting back to Under the Silver Lake, I have no clue. I never saw the movie. I don't think I've ever heard of the movie. So, but I do like symbolism. And it has caused me to be kind of intrigued. Kind of, maybe I'll watch Under the Silver Lake. Although I might have to talk my woman into watching it with me. She's got her own tastes. You know, she watches like chick flicks and stuff that, I mean, if there's no explosions, I mean, what's the point of watching a movie if there's no explosions, you know? Anyways, I'm just going to move on to Paludnyawa Brahman's third or fourth question. Would you kindly explain the Bermuda Triangle? And unfortunately, I watched a documentary about the Bermuda Triangle several years ago, and there's some peculiarity of the ocean floor there. It's kind of the shallow water there with sort of like a chalk floor that causes the radar to like bounce off of it irregularly or to cause like false signals and so forth. I don't know if that would have anything to do with ships disappearing, but it could be responsible for certain planes to like crash into the water and just disappear under the water, that kind of thing. But I'm approximately as skeptical of the idea that aliens are abducting entire vehicles from that area as I am that aliens built the pyramids. So I would assume that some of it is just coincidence, that there's like famous cases of ships and airplanes disappearing in that area, that there could be some peculiarity that's causing, you know, it's some sort of strange, what's the word? Not geography, geological, like some geological anomaly or something there that messes with like instruments and so forth, that causes things to mess up. Something like that I consider to be more likely than anything paranormal or of alien origin. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is has sort of a long intro to it before he gets to the actual question. And this is going to be less than 3 hours, trust me. All you got to do is look at the time and see how long it's going to last. I don't have that luxury. I don't know exactly how long it's going to be. We're getting up close to 2 hours because I'm digressing wildly. Anyways, Dharma River says, I'm extremely surprised you don't know who Shantideva is. He was a bit of a rebellious and solitary monk who caught a list of criticism by the other monks because of his, who caught a lot of criticism by the other monks because of his unorthodox methods. The monks even tried to set him up for failure at one point, and it backfired on them big time. Sounds like Donald Trump there. His story is also very similar to the Buddha's. Well, that's not Donald Trump. Both were born to great wealth and were supposed to become kings and renounced it in order to pursue liberation. I strongly recommend you read his book, Bodhisattvacharyavatara, a guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life. So he's obviously a Mahayana figure. I think you will like it. He teaches the Dhamma in a beautiful poetic style. I don't know if you enjoy Dhamma taught through poetry. And now we get to the question. How about Milarepa or Longchenpa? Do you know any of them? If yes, what do you think of them? Thank you. Well, I have no idea who Longchenpa is, although his name sounds Tibetan. But Milarepa, there we go. We finally hit upon somebody that I have some familiarity with. So I read Evans Wentz's translation, or at least the edition that he edited of the Songs of Milarepa, which included an autobiography of Milarepa, which I found much more interesting than Milarepa's verses. And I mean, poetry is fine. Like most of the Sutta Nipata is poetry. You know, it's like the Jataka Wagga is composed in poetry, and that's like my favorite spiritual poetry would be the Jataka Wagga of the Sutta Nipata. So when he says, I don't know if you enjoy Dhamma taught through poetry, well, I mean, poetry was like a common vehicle of Dhamma teachings in early Buddhism. Like I said, almost the entire Sutta Nipata is composed in poetry. Lots and lots of poetry. Almost all of the protection chants, the paritas, are in verse. Lots and lots of verses. Some of the most profound texts in Theravada, in Pali literature, like the Udana always has a verse. The Sagata Wagga, which is the first section of the Samyutta Nikaya, all verses. Terigata, all verses. So there's a lot of profound teachings in Pali that is composed in poetry, and for me, that's my favorite kind of spiritual poetry. Would be, I mean, I think the Bhagavad Gita also is in verse. The English translations are not so much in verse, but I'm pretty sure the Bhagavad Gita is in verse. Maybe the Upanishads? I'm not entirely sure, because I mean, when you read an English translation, it doesn't have meter and rhyme to it anymore anyway, or not even meter. I don't think ancient Indian poetry did rhyme. Milarepa, though, and like the poems of Han Shan, I read those. But Milarepa, his autobiography was fascinating, much more so than his verses. I mean, just, you know, praising Buddha and Dhamma and all that. It's fine, but I mean, his life was, I mean, he was really into it. You know, he starts off he's got like the cruel uncle who, I mean, his father dies, and then his father's brother essentially swindles his mother and I think he had a brother, out of their property. And so the mother, being vindictive, sends young Milarepa to some sorcerer to learn black magic so he can get revenge on the evil uncle, which he does. You know, he destroys the evil uncle and his family by conjuring up some huge scorpion-like creature that just attacked the house and caved it in while they were inside of it. Something like that, if I remember correctly. But then Milarepa, he has got, you know, the seeds, the roots of wisdom. And so, you know, he decided to change his ways, and he becomes a good Buddhist. I think he was ordained. I'm not entirely sure. But at one point, he's living out in a cave, you know, in Tibet somewhere. And he lives out there by himself until his clothes just rot off. And he's mostly living on nettles. And so he's eating nettles every day, living almost entirely on a diet of nettles until his body turns green. And there's this naked green man, probably very hairy, living out in the woods. And people just assumed it was a monster. They were just scared shitless of Milarepa. At one point, the pot where he would cook his nettles, he dropped it and broke it. And there was like this scum of dried nettle residue inside the pot that remained intact and pot-shaped. I remember that part from the autobiography. But just reading about his life was much more interesting to me than reading the songs that he composed. And that's the way it was with Han Shan also. I derived much more memorable, useful knowledge and entertainment from just reading the biography of Han Shan, some of which was included in his poetry. You know, some of the poetry would include autobiographical information, but that was more interesting to me than their take on Dhamma or Dharma. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from HV20 Canon. And HV20 Canon says, what is the nature of your opinion with respect to the channel Theory of Samsara? And I don't think I've ever seen any single video on a channel called Theory of Samsara. I'm completely unfamiliar with it. Sorry about that, but at least it made it an easy question to answer that didn't take very long. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And we're getting towards the bottom here. This is the second to last question. And this is from Wayne. And Wayne says, what are your thoughts on the Visuddhimagga? Is it at a reliable read? It seems to be more organized and easier to read than the Pali Canon. Thoughts? So my thoughts on the Visuddhimagga. First of all, it's not really like a synopsis of the suttas. That the suttas are Buddhism. The Visuddhimagga is Buddhagosism. Buddhagosa is the composer, like the editor, compiler, composer of the almost said the Jataka, the Visuddhimagga. And Visuddhimagga is largely a manual on what is considered to be samatha meditation, although a lot of it seems pretty hypnotic to me. Like the emphasis on kasina discs, where you're just staring at this colored disc until, you just meditate on that and meditate on it and meditate on it until you can see it as clearly with your eyes closed as when your eyes are open. And then you start manipulating it, making it bigger and smaller and messing around with this kind of stuff. And that kind of thing really wasn't interesting to me very much. Kind of as a way of becoming literate with regard to what Theravada Buddhist orthodoxy is about. But a lot of it, most of it is not particularly useful. Like the first chapter is good, which is just the value of morality. The second chapter is interesting because that is the overview of the 13 dhutangas, or optional ascetic practices. So that was interesting. Like the first two chapters, that was the only required reading when I was a young monk. My teacher told me to read the first two chapters on the value of morality and the dhutangas. But there's also just kind of anthropological stuff and cultural stuff you can learn. Like there is like an overview of the 32 parts of the body. And so you're learning like early medieval Sri Lankan beliefs about how the body works. Like, for example, they didn't know that the heart was a blood pump. They didn't know that the blood was circulated by the heart. They thought that blood was circulated through a kind of splashing effect produced by the liver. That the heart was the organ of thought. That thought arose in like one of the chambers of the heart in the midst of some blood. And your personality type would determine what color the blood was. On one personality type, you'd have sort of like a pale pink blood in this chamber of the heart. And almost the only really like empirical statement that was based just on observation was that if your spleen protrudes from your body, you die. That's included in the Visuddhimagga. Like the brain, he was hard pressed to find a use for the human brain. The brain is considered to be bone marrow inhabiting a large hollow bone. And if you get sick, like you get a cold, some of it melts and liquefies and comes out your nose in the form of snot. That kind of thing is interesting. Some of the stories about early like Sri Lankan monks, some of them are supposed to be edifying, but they're pretty extreme stories. It's like there was one monk that the king of Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, or whatever, or Lanka, I guess it would just be called Lanka back then. The king would come to visit him, and sometimes one of the queens or the only queen would come to visit him, and no matter who came to visit him, the monk would always say, "Long live the king." And then finally they asked him why he always says, even if the queen comes to visit him, he says, "Long live the king." It's because he never looks up. He doesn't know who he's talking to, as though he couldn't really tell by the sound of their voice or some such. There was another story, I think it was about a monk who had these beautiful murals painted all on the ceiling of his cave, and he never noticed them once because he's always looking downwards. This is all supposed to be edifying, like role models that you should do if you want to follow, if you want to be a good monk. There's the story of the monk who lived in the forest, and thieves, bandits, tie him up with living vines. You know, there's some vines growing. They just grab them without uprooting them or anything, tie him up, take whatever stuff he had, which probably wasn't very much, leave, and then when they're leaving, they like kick over a lamp or something and start a forest fire. And this monk is so strict in following Vinaya that he's not going to harm a living plant by getting himself untangled from these vines that he's tied up in. So he voluntarily dies in the forest fire rather than break the vines and hurt the plant in order to become free and save himself. And then, of course, he becomes enlightened at the moment of death. So you can get stories like that, but it's not really a synopsis of the suttas. It's the suttas are Buddhism, and the commentarial tradition is Buddhism, which is like a later attempt to really systematize the information in the suttas into a unified, like more or less self-consistent theory or system, and it doesn't always work. So the Visuddhimagga, it's not canonical. You know, it's like the central text in the commentarial tradition. You know, it's like the hub of the commentarial tradition. All the other commentaries are like spokes coming out from the hub, kind of a thing. I mean, it may be of value for some people to read it, and even some serious monks, like Western monks especially, just won't bother because they want to know what the Buddha taught and not what Buddhaghosa taught. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is the very, very last question. And this is from Count 9. And Count 9 says, you mentioned in one of the previous Q&A last year the story of a monk who mainly spent effort to memorize the scriptures in a pointless way, unless unsatisfied with his spiritual progress, also blamed by his companions, he changed his approach. Let's see, eventually, EVTL dot, I guess it's eventually, he finds a teacher, an enlightened child monk, as other potential candidates hesitated to teach him, as he was a monk who was more senior to them. The junior triggered a breakthrough by using the parable, How to Catch a Lizard. The name of the elder sounds for me like Potila. Unfortunately, my hearing is sometimes bad. Could you please give me the exact name and where I could find it in the scriptures? I will honestly try to use it, not for the purpose of memorizing it in a pointless way. And he's got a smiley face. I tried to find it by my own, including the use of AI, unfortunately without success, as I always got lost in the ocean of available Buddhist information. Okay, so this is the story of Potila, P-O-T-T-H-I-L-A. That name again, P-O-T-T-H-I-L-A. And I think the T's have dots under them, but don't worry about that. And it is found in the Dhammapada commentary. It is the commentary to verse 282 of the Dhammapada. So you will find the story as a commentary to verse 282 in the Dhammapada commentary. And this is another case of, I was asked previously what the Buddha taught to children, and I was thinking in terms of lay children and just completely spaced off the fact that there were, according to the text, according to tradition, enlightened children that were ordained as novices. That some children became enlightened, I think including the enlightened child novice in this story, as soon as the razor touched their head to shave their head to become ordained. You know, it's like before you're ordained, you have to get your head shaved. As soon as the razor touched his scalp, he became enlightened. So he was so ripe for enlightenment that, I mean, he was just waiting for the Buddha and waiting to be ordained, and boom, that was all it took. And yeah, it is a good meditation technique. I used to call it third gear. You know, it wasn't the highest meditation technique that I practiced occasionally, but it was a fairly advanced meditation technique where, according to the story, Potila, you know, he's memorizing all the texts. He's very learned, and the Buddha keeps calling him Pointless Potthila. Tucha Potila, I think it is in the Pali. You know, it's just like empty empty Potila. You know, it's like, here comes Pointless Potthila. There goes Pointless Potila, I should say. Potila. Pointless Potila. And I do think that I've got the whole story translated in one of my books. I'm pretty sure. Anyways, so, I mean, because he's so learned and he's respected on the Sangha, he's a senior monk and he's very learned with regard to the text, which is an anachronism because in the Buddhist time, there were no texts yet. There was no Abhidhamma to master, anything like that. So, finally, he asked the Buddha, why do you keep calling me this? And the Buddha says, it's because you're not meditating. You're spending all your time studying this intellectual stuff. So then Potila takes the hint and he goes off looking for someone to teach him. And for some reason, he walks hundreds of miles, if I remember correctly. Finally gets to this monastery and goes to the senior monk there and says, please teach me how to meditate. And because he's a senior monk and he's well respected and everything, that he doesn't want to teach him, even though everybody at this monastery is enlightened. Everyone's an arahant at this monastery. And so he just keeps going down the roster until finally the last one that he hasn't asked yet is this 9-year-old enlightened novice. And so the enlightened novice, tells him, all right, if you want me to teach you, first, just wade out into that pond. So without hesitation, Potila just starts wading out into the pond. And so then the kid calls him back. He had proven that he's willing to do what he says, even if it sounds ridiculous. So then he gives him the meditation instruction. It's like, and it's all in like a simile. It's like, let's say you've got a termite mound that's got 6 holes and there's a lizard inside that termite mound and you want to catch that lizard. So what you do is you block off 5 of the holes and then you watch very carefully that 6th hole so that when the lizard comes out, you can grab it. And it's a simile for how to meditate by sort of blocking off the 5 sense doors of seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, tasting. And so the only sense door left is the mind. So, you're sitting there in isolation with your eyes closed, you're not tasting or, anything like that. And you're just watching the mind intently. And when a thought arises, you catch it. And that's how you meditate. It's like you catch the thought and the thought just kind of disappears because you can't think and note the thought at the same time. It's like the same part of the brain, assuming this going with neurophysiology, that by noting a thought, the thought stops. So if you note it immediately, the thought will start to arise and then just disappear. And then if you get really good at it, you're just sitting there in silence. Intently, you're in the state of intentness. And as if any thought even begins to arise, you just catch it and it disappears again. But this all might be unnecessary information because all he's got to do, all that Count 9 has to do, is just look up the Dhammapada commentary, verse 282. Like, for example, I already mentioned Burlingame's Buddhist Legends is public domain now. And you can download it for free off the internet, I am sure. I think I've done that myself, in fact. So that's it. We're done. We done. I didn't even open the emergency backup beverage for this one. So let's see. We're a little over 2 hours. That's not too bad. Okay, then. And like I always should say at the beginning and almost never do, if you have any questions you think that I can answer, especially about like early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism in particular, Buddhism in general, like Indian philosophy even more in general, Eastern philosophy even more in general, philosophy just completely in general, that kind of thing, meditation, monasticism, Burma, me personally, etc. Just include them put them in the comments below. No more than 3 questions per episode, please. And if you do like these Q&As, some people do, takes all kinds. So if you like these Q&As, feel free to smash the like button. Don't just press it. Smash the son of a bitch. And subscribe if you haven't already. And if you please, be happy.